Welcome back. Let's pick up where we left off, diving deeper into these upcoming local elections. We were just starting to talk about this idea of projected national vote share.
Right. It's like a way to try and measure how a party is doing overall, even with just the smaller set of elections we have this year. And the sources you gave us have all these numbers showing how it's gone up and down over the past 10 years for the main parties. It's really interesting to see the patterns.
Yeah, one thing that really stands out is that Labor's projected national vote share, when you look at local elections, it tends to be lower than in general elections, and that's something we see again and again.
That is interesting. It seems kind of backward. If they're popular enough to win nationally, shouldn't they be doing well locally too?
Well, it's not quite as straightforward as that. Remember we talked about how local elections have their own unique way of working.
Yeah.
Parties like the Greens, the Lib Dems, and even independents, they often do better locally when they aren't competing so directly against those two big parties.
So it's like voters feel more free to show their support for smaller parties when it's not like a winner take all situation like in a general election. But how do they actually figure out this projected national vote share thing? What goes into that calculation?
It's a pretty complex process, but basically they take the results from the councils that are having elections and then use demographic data and past voting patterns to kind of project that out to a national level.
So it's like they're building this mini model of the whole country using these smaller elections. But how accurate can that model really be, especially this year with so few councils up for grabs?
That's a great question. We always have to remember that projected national vote share is just an estimate, and it has its limits. The fewer councils involved, the less reliable that projection becomes. And like we've said, these elections are mostly happening in areas that usually vote conservative, so the results might not really reflect what's happening across the whole country.
Right. So it's a useful tool to get a general sense of the political landscape, but we need to be careful about reading too much into the numbers, especially with the unique situation we have this year.
Exactly. Okay, let's switch gears a bit and focus on how each party might do. We've talked a lot about Labor, but what about the Conservatives? How do you think they'll fare in these elections?
Well, they're currently in control of most of the councils that are up for election, so they're definitely starting off strong. But with this new Reform Party and the possibility that voters might not be happy with how the government's doing, are they in danger of losing some of their power?
They're definitely facing some challenges. The Reform Party is aiming right for their core voters, and there's always that chance of what we call midterm blues, where people start to get disillusioned with the party that's in power.
And we can't forget about the liberal Democrats. They're hoping to make some gains too. They've always been strong in local government, and they could benefit if people are looking for an alternative to both the conservatives and labor.
Absolutely. The Lib Dems often get seen as the safe option for voters who aren't happy with either of the two big parties.
So it's not just a battle between two sides. There are several parties fighting for power in these local elections, and the results could really shake things up nationally.
Exactly. And that's what makes these elections so interesting to watch. They're like a mini version of the bigger political changes happening across England.
Okay, before we jump into the mayoral races, I want to go back to something you said earlier about Labor never really gaining seats in local elections while they were in power nationally. Why do you think that happens?
It's a really interesting pattern, and it shows just how tough it is to be in charge at both the national and local levels at the same time. A lot of times, the policies that are needed to tackle big national issues might not be popular in certain communities.
So even if a party is doing well nationally, they might make decisions that upset voters in certain areas. And since local elections often become a way for people to show how they feel about the party in power, those local frustrations can lead to them losing seats.
Exactly. It reminds us that politics isn't just one big thing. Voters care about different things depending on whether it's local or national. And any party that wants to stay in power everywhere needs to understand those differences.
And that brings us back to how important it is to understand the context of these elections. We can't just assume that what's happening nationally will be repeated locally.
Right. We have to think about the specific people living in each area, the local issues that matter to them, and the individual candidates running for office. It's not simple at all.
Speaking of complicated things, let's talk about those mayoral races. We mentioned that there are 6 of them happening alongside these council elections, and Labor is trying to hold on to 4 of those seats. What makes these races so hard to predict?
Well, one thing is that they often come down to the personalities of the candidates. Voters might be more likely to support someone based on who they are and what experience they have, rather than just their party.
So things like name recognition and reputation locally can matter more than in council elections, where voters might not know as much about the individual candidates.
Absolutely. And don't forget, they changed the voting system to first past the post for these mayoral elections, which adds another layer of complexity.
Right, because it means the candidate with the most support in a certain area can win, even if they don't get the most votes overall. This could really help candidates from smaller parties or even those running as independents if they have a strong base of support in a particular part of the city.
Exactly. And it also encourages something called tactical voting, which is where people might vote for a candidate they don't love just to prevent someone they dislike even more from winning.
So there's a lot more strategic thinking involved in these mayoral races. And since people often see these elections as a sign of what's happening nationally, the results could be important beyond just the cities themselves.
Absolutely. Political analysts and commentators will be watching these races closely because they could give us some valuable clues about how voters are feeling across the country.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about projected national vote share, looked at how each party might do, and gotten into the details of the mayoral races. As we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what are the main things you want our listeners to remember?
Well, the most important thing is to remember that context is everything. These elections are happening under very specific circumstances, a limited number of councils, mostly in areas that lean conservative, and this new reform party shaking things up.
So we can't just look at the numbers without thinking about all of that.
Right. And we also need to be aware of the limitations of the data, especially when it comes to that projected national vote share. The fewer councils we have, the less reliable that projection is going to be.
So let's not get too carried away trying to apply these results to the whole country.
But at the same time, don't underestimate how important these elections are. They give us a valuable glimpse into what's happening politically in England right now, and they offer clues about what might happen in the next general election.
It's like we're peeking through a keyhole trying to see what's going on in a much bigger room.
Exactly. And the more we understand about how things work in these local elections, the better we'll be able to understand the bigger political picture.
All right, welcome back to our deep dive into these English local elections. We've looked at the data, the history, the main players. Now let's zoom out a bit. What do these elections tell us about, the future of British politics?
That is the question, isn't it? These elections, even though they're smaller in scale, can really give us hints about what might be happening on the national level down the road.
One thing I've been thinking about is the Reform Party and how they're doing. They're pretty new to all this, but they've been getting a lot of attention with their let's say their strong opinions and their focus on things like immigration and, Britain being independent. Do you think they could really shake up the way things work politically here?
It's definitely possible. They've managed to connect with voters who feel like the bigger parties aren't listening to their concerns. And if they do well in these local elections, even if it's just a little bit, it could give them a boost going into the next general election.
It'll be interesting to see if they can turn these local wins into something bigger, something national. But we can't forget about the other parties either. Labor wants to get back in charge after being out of power for so long, while the Conservatives are trying to hold on to what they have. And then you've got the Liberal Democrats who are trying to find their place as the reasonable option compared to the two big parties.
It's a pretty complicated picture, that's for sure. And these local elections are sort of like a testing ground where we can see how all these different groups are interacting and maybe try to predict what will happen on a bigger scale.
And with the general election just a couple of years away, all the parties are going to be watching these results very carefully. These local elections could be super important for them to test out their strategies and their messages.
Exactly. They want to see what works with voters, what issues people are really worried about, and what kind of campaigning actually gets results.
So, for someone who's been following along with us on this deep dive, what are the key things they should be looking for as these elections happen?
Well, first off, pay attention to how many people actually vote. Is there a lot of energy and excitement, or do people seem kind of tuned out? If a lot of people vote, it could mean that they really care about who wins. But if not many people vote, it could mean they're feeling disillusioned with the whole thing.
That's a good point. Beyond just the numbers, are there other things we should be looking for that might give us clues about where British politics is headed?
Look for any signs that people are changing who they usually vote for. Are they sticking with the same parties, or are they open to new options? Are there certain groups of voters who seem more likely to switch sides or be persuaded by new ideas?
And what about the issues themselves? Are there any particular topics or concerns that are coming up a lot in these local campaigns?
The cost of living is always a big one, especially now with everything going on economically. But we might also see things like healthcare, education, and crime being really important in these elections. It'll be interesting to see how each party talks about these issues and whether voters buy what they're selling.
So it's not just about who wins or loses, it's about how they do it and what that tells us about what voters really care about.
Exactly. These local elections are like a smaller version of the bigger political conversations happening across Britain. And
Right.
it's a chance for people to voice their opinions, for parties to try out their ideas, and for all of us to get a sense of what might be coming next.
And with the political landscape changing so much, these elections feel even more important. They could be a sign of what's to come, a glimpse into the future direction of British politics.
It's a really interesting and unpredictable time, and I'm definitely curious to see how it all unfolds.
Well, thanks so much for walking us through all of this. It's been a really insightful look at these English local elections. And to our listener, we hope this deep dive has helped you understand these elections better and how they might shape the future of British politics.
Remember, these elections are just one piece of the puzzle. But if we pay attention to the details, look for patterns, and stay open-minded, we can all be more informed and engaged citizens.
So stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay involved. The future of British politics is in our hands.